That storm's pretty bad. That probably will make it to Baron's next lecture in this. Reminds me, do you know Vadrik? He recently covered the moon and its effects on lycanthropes in the Natural Order of Innistrad. You haven't heard of him? Well, that makes sense considering he's on Innistrad. He's really talented in his lessons, especially if you love to cast a lot of blue-red spells, use X-cost instant sorceries, and when using powerful lines that differ from game to game. I'll recap one of his lectures, but first. Who is Vadrik? An astromancer from Nephalia, a coastal province on Innistrad. His 40 years of experience lead him to not only be widely respected, but an exceptional boon when it comes to researching the mystery that is Innistrad's moon. These studies have led to warding off one of the local menaces, werewolves. And to top it all off, he's fought Eldrazi during Emrakul's corruption of the plane. While he hasn't retired yet, he prefers to be at home and draw charts of the stars. Charts that guide many travelers safely during Innistrad's treacherous nights. Vadrik, Astral Archmage, is a 3-mana, 1 generic blue-red, 1/2 human wizard. It reads, if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Vadrik, Astral Archmage enters. In my opinion, the most important text box, instant and sorcery spells you cast cost X less to cast, where X is Vadrik's power. And finally, whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, put a +1/+1 counter on Vadrik. Let's discuss the mechanic in the room. Day and night. Day and night is a game state that is only introduced to the current game if a card states so. To change from day to night, a player must cast no spells during their own turn. It then becomes night next turn. To change from night to day, a player must cast at least 2 spells during their turn, where it then becomes night next turn. Nightbound permanents like werewolves are affected by this mechanic, but since we don't run any, we won't be caring about it being day or night, just that we get those +1/+1 counters on Vadrik from its switching. Now, this mechanic is a bit infamous, since once it's introduced, it doesn't disappear even when the permanent that relies on it goes away. It makes sense on why it doesn't, but sometimes when a deck runs a single card in the 99 that has the mechanic, is eventually removed, technically players still have to keep track of day and night. The solution to not annoy the table is make it your responsibility to keep track of the mechanic. It's integral for the deck, so make sure you pay attention to it. Before we move on, day and night isn't as hard to switch as you think. Since Commander is a 4-player game, there's always a chance a player plays 2 spells during the turn, or passes to keep up protection or removal. I expect him to get at least 1 +1/+1 counter around the table, but 2 if you're lucky enough. But speaking of removal, Vadrik is a commander who can snowball out of hand, so players who have seen it typically are more ready to use it on Vadrik. Make sure to leave up a counterspell or have some plan to protect him to get that cost reduction going. Now, to discuss Vadrik. Vadrik is one of many Izzet Spellslinger commanders, but one I can say I love to play, since the Power Matters theme kind of breaks the monotony of a standard spellslinging deck. Commanders I consider similar to Vadrik are Veyran, Stellali, and Mizzix. These commanders all are considered Spellslinger, but go about it in a different manner. Not to mention, are also a lot more common than our friend Vadrik, who doesn't even sit at the top 10 Izzet commanders. Why is this? Personally, I think it's due to the build around of having to increase his power and protect him while doing so that turns people away from him. But I argue that's what makes the deck fun and unique. The Power Matters theme in Izzet is a clever cost reducer and ties into how I built Vadrik and the main topic of this video, X-cost spells. But before we go into our X-themed cards, let's first discuss cards that go into any Vadrik deck regardless of the sub-theme. For this part, there's honestly a lot of cards I can cover, since Spellslinger decks have similarities, but I'll try and keep it specific to Vadrik. Starting with the main gimmick, we need to increase Vadrik's power so we can play our spells for cheap. Clout of the Dominus, a 1 mana for either blue or red, gives a creature +1/+1 on Shroud if it's blue, and a +1/+1 along with haste if it's red. Good thing Vadrik's both. So, for 1 mana, we can protect our Commander of Shroud, boost his power by additional 2, so our instants and sorceries are discounted by 3, since the base power is 1. The downside is Shroud means we cannot target Vadrik ourselves, and we have several clone effects like Spark Double and Irenicus' Vile Duplication. It makes it a bit of a nombo, but hey, he still gets counters from his base ability switching from day to night. If you were familiar with Standard before it rotated out, the Celestis is a great 3 CMC mana rock that plays into our Commander's day-night mechanic. It gives us the option to tap and switch from one to the other, along with a bit of rummage, so running it is a bit of a no-brainer. Another 3 mana rock, Heraldic Banner on either blue or red, assures Vadrik's power will be at least 2 when we play him. Essentially, this mana rock reads, tap to add 1 mana of any color, and instants and sorceries we cast cost 1 less to cast. That's if we have Vadrik out. And if we have clones of Vadrik out, it reduces the cost even further since it pumps all their power. Seething Anger and Lunar Frenzy play very well into boosting Vadrik's power, especially for Seething Anger. We can pay the buyback cost if Vadrik's power is at least 3, and on top of that, if we cast it with Stormkill and Artist on the field, it allows us to infinitely cast it. This is because if we pay for the buyback cost and the initial cost of the spell, it leaves us with just needing to pay a single red. But since we casted the spell, and Stormkiln Artist nets us a treasure, this means we can cast it an infinite number of times on not just Vadrik, but any of our creatures. This is one of many small combos in the deck, but there's not a specific one to win the game. Like most Izzet decks, it just kinda wins. Tezzeret's Gambit can be a free spell as long as Vadrik's power is 3 and we pay 2 life. This will also proliferate our counters on Vadrik, once again boosting his power. It's a really sweet card when you pull it off. I recommend Scour from Existence as well. A 7 mana instant to exile target permanent is not a good rate. But once again, thanks to Vadrik, we don't just reduce the cost. We can make it free if his power is high enough. Wrapping up this section, I'll recommend the usual suspects and spell slingers, such as the previously mentioned Stormkiln Artist, extra turn spells, Jeska's Will, Big Score, and so on and so forth. What's really fun about a commander like this is you can make it chock full of your favorite blue-red spells, and you'd still end up very strong. The open-endedness to his generic cost reduction ability makes it so no two decks are quite the same, which confuses me. He only has roughly 3,500 decks on EDH Rec. X-costed spells are fantastic for Vadrik, since X can be reduced by Vadrik's power. Several X-costed spells are used in some Vadrik decks I've seen, but I really wanted to lean into the theme. I'm currently running 15 X-costed spells and plan to add more as time goes on. I've broken down my X-costed spells into 2 categories, removal and value. In some rarer instances, they can double up as removal and value, such as Thassa's Intervention. In these cases, I'll mention the side that I use the most and categorize it as such. I won't be covering every single X-costed spell, since there are some that are pretty simple, like Condescend and Syncopate. Just the ones that I think are fun and you're looking to cast at later stages of the game. Let's start with removal since it's really straightforward. Comet Storm, X, red, is an instant speed with a multi-kicker of 1. Choose target creature or player, then choose another target for each time Comet Storm was kicked. Comet Storm deals X damage to each of them. Early game, this picks off mana dorks and low toughness value creatures your opponents are amassing, but it really shines late game. This can be an instant speed board wipe, removing the most problematic creatures, or even a huge bolt of damage to each of your opponent's face, burning them out for the win. Hell to Pay. For just X and a red, deals X damage to target creature. Where this card shines is it makes a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to the excess damage that was dealt to the creature, ramping us for removing a creature. It becomes even better with Galazeth Prismari on the field, since he makes the value that much sweeter since the treasures will tap for mana without sacrificing. I do think Sun and Demise is worth a mention as a pseudo board wipe. At sorcery speed for a red and X, it deals X damage to each creature of the chosen color. If we really do have to kill Vadrik doing so, I'm sure someone has a board state that makes it worth doing. Electro Dominance. An instant for X red deals damage to any target, but we get to cast a card. Not just an instant or a sorcery, a card. Mana X or less from our hand without paying its mana cost. This ignores timing restrictions, so we can do some tricky plays in response to an opponent's spell. Maybe either cloning Vadrik or just board wiping. Next are X value spells. This is where our shenanigans ensue, especially if we copy them, like Galvanic Iteration or Storm King's Thunder, which we'll cover right now. For X triple red, it certainly is our most mana-intensive pip X cost spell, but for good reason. When we cast our next instant or sorcery spell, we copy it X times. And we may choose new targets for the copy. Boring option, we choose extra turn spells. The big brain option, we choose Chaos Warp, remove our opponent's entire board, and then they flip into nothing. I've copied Chaos Warp 15 times before this spell. It's downright gross. But seriously, there's a lot of options for spells to copy in this deck, and I'll doubt you ever find it a dead card. Next, Thassa's Intervention. A X blue instant, it gives us 2 modes. We can either look at the top X cards of our library, put up to 2 of them into our hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, or counter target spell unless its controller pays twice X. Great flexibility, and hopefully you're using this for the first mode, but it's a fine backup counter spell. Expansion Explosion is almost always going to be cast for Explosion, an X blue red instant, but expansion by itself is not bad. If you can definitely save it for late game, where you can at least deal 4 and draw 4, I think that's where the line is drawn. The damage to this card is an upside, but mostly you're looking for this to refill your hand late game. This card really highlights what we want for our X spells. Big damage and big draws. These next 3 are relatively the same, drawing cards for X but with different upsides. Pull from Tomorrow, our most straightforward draw X spell, is simply draw X cards, then discard a card. I expect this to get power crept eventually, but for now it's made the deck list. And look at that card art, it's just beautiful. Drown in Dreams. For the longest time I really didn't like this card, and I didn't see a use for it. X2 and blue just seemed like too steep of a cost for what it did. But I finally found it works well in an X cost reduction deck. Like the previous mentioned mana cost, for X2 and blue, it's an instant that gives us a single choice. Unless we have our commander out, then we can choose both. The first option is target player draws X cards, and the second is target player mills twice X cards. Obviously we want the card draw, but also you should self-target for the mill, since we have ways to play spells out of our graveyard or reshuffle our graveyard back into our library. It's literally only an upside for us. Finally, Finale of Revelation. X blue sorcery is just draw X cards. But if X is 10 or more, we instead shuffle our graveyard into our library, draw X cards, untap up to 5 lands, and we now have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. After we cast it, unfortunately, we do exile Finale of Revelation. I greed way too much to be healthy when I draw this card, but it's a staple for an X-cost Spellslinger deck for a very good reason. Besides the card draw, the untap of lands can be a net positive if we have Vadrik's power high enough. That, plus coupled with the card draw, can be a GG on the spot. Is Vadrik dying a lot, even after you counter removal? It happens, and it's unfortunate, but we do have several solutions. Spark Double and Vial Duplication can copy Vadrik, but obviously if he's already on the field. It's not the worst solution, but still, we want a cost reduction effect that lasts to cast our X-cost spells. Mind Splice Apparatus serves as a backup to Vadrik. We can flash it in on an opponent's end step and get that first counter on our turn. Every turn after, it'll get another counter to reduce our spells further. Goblin Electromancer is a cheap option that reduces our instants and sorceries by 1, and so is the newly released Otter, Stormcatch Mentor. We can clone these guys as well to get further cost reduction. Moving on, we have cards that are overperformers and all-stars, and of course, personal favorites. Hear me out. This may be the blue mage in me putting this card here, but it's hilarious. Now, what is better than countering someone's spell? Bouncing it back to their hand? Removing an opponent's creature, maybe? How about just ending their turn? Discontinuity, an expensive instant clocking in with 3 mana triple blue. Now all this spell does is simply end the turn. This counters all spells on the stack and acts like an in-turn normally would at MTG. It's simple, but it's vicious. Besides being direct, we don't actually always have to use it on our opponents. We can actually use it on our own turn for cheaper. For 2 and a blue as a sort of counterspell for stopping an opponent from interacting with us, but unfortunately we do lose the rest of our turn. I say give it a go. It's a very fun card, and I plan on adding it to more blue decks if I can somehow justify its inclusion. I mean, the card art alone can justify an inclusion. Vulcan Baga killed it with this one. Lear, Disciple of the Drowned. As a steep 5-mana creature, you'll at times be hesitant on playing him, but the upsides he provides when he does survive is second to none. Being able to flashback all our spells is a must answer from our opponents, and if they can't answer Lear, he's just going to drown them in card advantage. Side note, don't forget spells can no longer be countered. That comes at way more than you think. Sublime Epiphany. A 4-mana blue instant gives us a ton of options, but with a steep 6-mana CMC, this card is played a lot less than a typical counter. But since our theme is cost reduction, it becomes an overperformer, more so than usual. We get 5 options. We're probably not going to use all of them, but here they are. We can either counter target spell, counter target activated or triggered ability, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, or finally, target player draws a card. All these are pretty obvious when you'll be casting the spell, but creating a token of Vadrik won't do anything since he's legendary and the legend rule exists, but Electromancer or our other non-legendary creatures are a fine choice. In fact, I'd go as far to say if you're running a big mana theme that has blue, this card should be one of the first in. Card art once again killing it, love blue art. Elementalist's Palette fits into our X-cost theme perfectly. A simple 3-mana, add 1 mana of any color mana rock on the surface, this can eventually seriously ramp our X-cost spells as we cast them. Every time we do cast an X-cost spell, we put 2 charge counters on the palette. We can then tap it for X, where X is the charge counters on the palette, but only on costs that are X. Auto-include into this X theme or any X theme for sure. Finally, not so much of a pet card, but just an overperformer, Apex of Power. 7 triple red sorcery usually means we have to do our usual shenanigans to make it work, but when it does, oh man, when it does, we get to exile the top 7 cards of our library. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among them. If this spell was cast from your hand, add 10 mana of any one color. Important note, you exile the cards, then choose the color you need the most to cast those cards. Admittedly, I didn't really know that for the longest time, it's kind of embarrassing. One thing about this card is I expected to exile itself like Finale of Revelation upon casting, but it doesn't. It just goes to our yard. This means we can get it back eventually for reshuffle, or Past in Flames, or maybe even a Mystic Retrieval. This deck can storm off pretty well. I recommend playtesting it and piloting it like a solitaire deck before introducing it to a playgroup, especially if they all know how to pilot their decks quickly. You'll know when you have the win of the deck, but getting there in a timely manner is another story. Overall, this deck remains close to my top 5 favorites as a strong but somewhat janky deck at times. Pulling Off the Wind feels less like a typical Storm EDH deck, and more like a creative dig-in, X-costed bomb spell you're trying to cast. That's probably due to the jank, but that's the fun in it. The deck list is linked in the description below, and is updated to my current version of the deck. Watching any of my 1-3 videos will have the deck list linked, so even if the deck in the video isn't updated, the deck list will be. Oh, you're late for your lecture now. Sorry, looks like I took too much of your time. Good luck though, I heard Miss Mayhaw is tough on tardiness. I'll see you later.